Okay, so welcome to everyone who has arrived before time for this two-part workshop on managing emotions mindfully. I'm Tejal from Sisters in Spirit, and there is also Nivita Arora who is here, who is the main volunteer helping Sisters in Spirit. So I take great pleasure in welcoming all of you, and of course, I'm so honored that Venerable Tenzin Chogkyi accepted our request to give teachings at Sisters in Spirit. And she has been so kind and generous with her time, really engaging in a very personal dialogue with me to arrive at the content, the topic, the format. And as some of you may have read, Venerable is right now in California and it's 6 a.m. over there. So that just goes to show her dedication, that she's really willing to carve out time to give these teachings. So her support really means so much. So before we begin, and hopefully before many other participants are able to join us, I would like to give a brief introduction to Venerable Tenzin Chogkyi. I do feel that Venerable, you have quite a unique position in the world of Tibetan Buddhism. You have a diverse intersectionality from which you speak, from a lot of personal experience. You are a Buddhist monastic, an activist, and a popular teacher who also leads retreats. And you love bridging the worlds of Buddhist thought, current events, and the latest research in the field of positive psychology. You're very passionate about social justice and have taught in prisons in the US, Colombia, Australia, and New Zealand. You are very interested in taking His Holiness's Dalai Lama's vision of secular ethics and bringing Dharma within a secular context to as many people as possible. You're also a certified teacher of the Compassion Cultivation Training Program, which I think runs out of Stanford. Or
Yes, it originated in Stanford. Yes.
that's
Yeah.
right. And also the Cultivating Emotional Balance program. And you are currently based on traditional Awas was Halone land. I'm sure I said that incorrectly.
No, you said it perfectly.
In what is now known as Santa Cruz, California. And as I already said, it's close to 6 a.m. So, yeah, I'm just so excited and looking forward to this workshop with you and with immersing in what is so close to our hearts. How can we manage our emotions better with the framework of positive psychology, Buddhist psychology, and contemplative practice? So, thank you so much. A very warm welcome to all the participants and to Venerable. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your kind invitation. When we were trying to figure out a time to meet with the 12 and a half hours difference between India and California, it was a little challenging. And then we finally realized, actually, for my schedule, 6 a.m. is not so terrible for me at all. I'm always awake by then. I'm usually not teaching a class at 6 a.m., but we realized that was the easiest time to do it. So thank you all. I think for most people on the call, it's evening time, so you're at the end of a busy day. So thank you all for joining. Yes, and as Tejal mentioned, this whole idea of kind of bridging Tibetan Buddhism, very traditional Tibetan Buddhism, with some of these more modern ways of thinking and understanding our own psychology, our own emotions, is something that's interested me a lot. Just to give a little bit of background about how, this workshop and some of the material from this workshop came together. And the year 2000, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had a meeting. There are these conferences called the Mind and Life meetings, Mind and Life Institute. And there was a workshop or a meeting, I think it was about a 5-day meeting, on the topic of destructive emotions. And so Buddhist scholars came together with psychologists and educators and neuroscientists and so forth to talk about this topic of disgustive emotions, to kind of bridge the understandings of modern psychology with Buddhist thought and Buddhist psychology. And out of this conference arose a request that His Holiness the Dalai Lama asked the people involved in that conference to come up with a training, a secular training using Buddhist contemplative techniques to try to get some sort of a training that would allow people to manage their emotions more mindfully, to cultivate emotional balance. And so I became interested and took the teacher training of that modality in 2013. And so I've been teaching that kind of system of looking at emotions ever since then. So I'm going to kind of borrow both from that training and from traditional Buddhist ideas. One of the things that came up, there's Anita, my old friend. I have to take a moment to greet her. I haven't seen her in ages. So one of the interesting things that came out of that conference was the fact that there isn't an exact equivalent word to, like, the English word emotion with all the connotation and so forth in the Buddhist philosophical literature. There isn't really a word that's exactly equivalent to emotion. So we'll talk about that a little bit, what I want to do in this weekend. Today, we're going to focus on emotions in a very general way. And then tomorrow, we're going to look specifically at the emotion of anger, which for most people is the one that they'd like the most help managing mindfully and cultivating awareness around, right? I've never once had a student come to me and said, Venerable Tenzin, I really need some strategies about managing my happiness, right? That's never, ever happened. But all kinds of people come and say, oh, I really need strategies around anger. And what do I do with anger? So we'll look at that specifically tomorrow. But what I want to do today is just give you kind of a general framework. We're going to look at the definition of emotion. We'll contrast it a little bit to some of the Buddhist ideas, because I know a lot of you have a background in Buddhism. And then we'll look at the function of emotions, what some of the most universal emotions are, and then start breaking down how do we apply awareness to those emotions. What I want to do first, though, is just set the framework for how we're going to work together with some guidelines for both working together on Zoom, on this wonderful platform that enables us to be together from all over the world, and then some communication guidelines for our time together. If we have time, I'd like to, we might do some work in small groups. We're going to have a lot of discussion. It's not just me going to be talking at you for an hour and a half. We're going to really engage in a lot of discussion. So there's some communication guidelines I'd love to suggest for our time together. So I'm going to share a slide, 2 slides. And the first is, and we've been working on Zoom for a long time, but there's some nice kind of guidelines for etiquette on Zoom. And one is joining the class with an attitude of showing up in an in-person class. If you were sitting in a class in a room, you wouldn't be on your phone and drinking and talking to people in the background. You'd be really present. And so we request that you show up with that same kind of attention and energy. Because of background noise, if you can mute yourself when you're not speaking, and we love it when people keep their videos on, if it's possible for you to keep your video on, because then it replicates as much as possible the feeling of an in-person class. We suggest you use gallery view to be able to see everybody in the class. Some people prefer speaker view because it's less distracting, but it's kind of nice to be able to see everyone. And we've got a small group so we can see everyone on one screen, and that's quite nice. I ask that you limit the use of chat for questions that come in. Sometimes people use the chat to kind of react and respond to anything that any thoughts they have during the class, right? Like something will resonate with them, and then they'll type into the chat, oh, me too, I feel exactly that same way. But it can be distracting, and in the same way you wouldn't be chatting with the people next to you if you were an in-person class, really trying to limit the chat for questions. And we love you to keep the video on, but if you need to move around or walk around, please turn your camera off just temporarily to reduce the distraction. It makes us all dizzy. If you're moving around and your background is changing, it can be not only distracting, but makes us all kind of dizzy. So those are just some guidelines for Zoom. And then in terms of communication, keep conversations confidential, both in big and small groups. So we're going to be talking about emotions, hopefully having a chance to share a little bit personally our experience with emotions. So really kind of keeping confidentiality. We're actually recording this session. We might, if we have a session where we debrief after an exercise and have people share their own experiences, I might ask that the recording just be paused for that moment when people are really sharing their personal experience, so that it's confidential and you feel comfortable sharing. Sharing your story and not offering advice. If you're in a small group with other people, we want to help people. The topic of the training is managing emotions mindfully. So people will bring things that are challenging to the discussion. And we often have a wish to help. And so we might have a tendency to give advice. But that's not really what the purpose of this is. It's not a problem-solving session. It's just talking about, what's going on for people in their emotional life. And then conscious participation. And what I mean by that is, I love it when people are enthusiastic and ask a lot of questions. But if you notice that you're taking up a lot of the collective time, that you always have your hand up, you always are asking a question, maybe allow time for some of the quieter voices. And then if you are one of the quieter voices and you're not offering much to the discussion, maybe consider offering something from your experience. And then asking permission for follow-up or feedback. You all may know each other and have relationships, outside of this space. If somebody has said something in the class and you'd like to talk to them about it afterwards, make sure you have their permission. They might share something in the class and feel quite finished, feel like, okay, I've said my piece. I don't really want to talk about it anymore. Sometimes what happens in in-person classes during the break, someone will run up to someone else who shared something and say, oh, I want to talk to you about that thing you shared, and you might want to try this, that, and the other, or I've had that experience. Sometimes people have shared something and shared some vulnerability, and they really just need the space to kind of sit with what they've shared. So asking permission for follow-up or feedback. So those are just some guidelines, and I'd love to just ask if there's anything else that anyone would feel you'd like to add to this list of guidelines, or any questions about these that would make it feel more like a safe space. And you can either raise your physical hand, because I can see everybody, or raise your virtual hand. Any comments or any questions about these guidelines? All right, so are we all good, in agreement? Thumbs up? Yes, good. All right, great, thank you. All right, so when we talk about emotions, I want to offer kind of a technical definition of emotion. But first, what I'd like to do is just have you think for a moment about a time recently where you felt like you had an emotion. We'll just do kind of a little reflection here. So think about the last time you felt something. It's the end of the day for all of you. So probably at some point today, or maybe many times, or maybe every minute, you were experiencing an emotion. So think about one of your most recent emotions. And then take a minute to think about, how do you identify that as an emotion? What are some of the characteristics of an emotion? How did you pick that experience? Was it a physical sensation? Was it thoughts? Was it some kind of response? Was it some kind of feeling in your body? What was it? What's an emotion? You know, we throw this word emotion around, but what are some of the characteristics of an emotion when you think about an emotion? And then when you're ready, if you want to type into the chat, we'll use the chat for a moment. And just enter in some of the things that came up for you. What are some of the characteristics of an emotion? And whatever comes up for you. And then we'll look at the definition that comes from the Cultivating Emotional Balance training. So anything at all that seems to be a characteristic of emotion.
They're in the body sometimes, a lot of the time.
Nivita, say again, I missed the first part.
They're in the body.
In the body. Okay, in the body. So we've got fear, tightness in the body. You can feel it. And then Nivita said in the body. So this physical sensation. What else? A feeling? Anything else? A physically felt sensation, tears, constriction in the throat, deep sigh, confusion, memories. So it's got a quality, a cognitive quality, these memories. And we say memory can be a trigger of emotion too. It doesn't even need to be what's happening right there in the moment. We can trigger a full emotional experience from memory or imagination too. Makes me smile or cry. Okay, great. Body, physical sensation, mind, the landscape of thoughts is shaped by the current emotional state. Awesome. A thought and a physical sensation. Great.
So, Venerable, I thought, I mean, when you asked us to recollect an emotion that we experienced recently, so I thought of feeling overwhelmed, that there was an emotion of overwhelmed. And then when you asked, how do you know that that is the emotion you're experiencing? So, of course, there are like there's a sudden shift in the energy pattern as on the physical level and as well as on the mental landscape. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great. Great. So a real shift in energy around it, right? So there's a charge, there's an energy, there's a shift. Yeah. There are also thoughts. Yeah. So I'm seeing a lot of physical component, also a lot of thoughts that accompany an emotion. So let's look for a minute. I'm going to share my screen again. Let's look at the definition from the Cultivating Emotional Balance training, and we'll really unpack this because it's very specific. It's a little technical, but we'll take it slowly. So when we think about an emotion, we say emotion is a process. Okay, sometimes we think an emotion is one tiny moment, and we'll look at this more later on, but emotion is a process, a particular kind of automatic appraisal influenced by our evolutionary and personal past. Okay, so automatic appraisal, we say in terms of evolutionary psychology that emotions bypass the cognitive thought process. They are quick acting because that automatic appraisal is necessary to save our lives, right? So you imagine, you're driving along in your car and an animal jumps out in front of the car, like in India, a monkey or something, jumps into the road. You immediately slam on the brakes. You don't have this time to think through, four-legged, creature jumped in front of the car. I guess I need to stop the car or else I'm going to hit you have this automatic appraisal and automatic response that doesn't even go through your cognitive process because it's too slow. right? So influenced by our evolutionary and our personal past. And some things in our emotional reactions are evolutionary and shared, something like that. An object, coming at you, right? Something kind of flying at you, you automatically duck. That's just something that's evolutionary. Or a loss of gravity. Your chair collapses. You have a fear response in that moment. Your adrenaline, your heart rate, right? Because if a loss of gravity in our evolutionary past meant we're falling off the cliff or something, or falling out of the tree or whatever. So there's certain emotional responses that are sort of hardwired, built in by our evolutionary past. And then there are many that are specific to us because of our personal past. And we'll really look at that because that's one of the ways that we can become very mindful of our emotional responses. Something happened to us as a child, right? Repeatedly, for example. And so we'll be triggered by some experience that maybe our friends won't be at all, right? And we'll look at that, bringing mindfulness to our triggers, to our specific triggers that are because of our personal past. And this is where we can bring a lot of awareness and really kind of unravel some of our more destructive emotional responses. So it's an automatic appraisal influenced by our evolutionary and personal past, in which we sense that something important to our welfare is occurring. So this is where emotions show up. Something important to our welfare is occurring. Now, it may be valid, it may not be so valid, right? That it really is impacting our welfare, but that's the felt sense. Oh, this is really, really important, right? So something important to our welfare is occurring, including a set of physiological changes. So you all mentioned that, many, many comments in the chat about these bodily sensations. And every emotion has a different type of physiological response that accompanies it, that is not conscious. You don't make it happen. It just accompanies that emotion. For example, with fear, with the emotion of fear, blood flows to your legs, preparing you to run. Even if you haven't run in 20 years, like I haven't, I can't run, I'm too old, can't do it. But the blood still flows to my legs, preparing me to run. And that's something, a physiological correlate to that emotion. With anger, it's very interesting. Blood flows to your hands, preparing you to fight. So this isn't conscious. So physiological changes and behaviors that start to prepare you to deal with that situation. So emotions are thought to have arisen because they efficiently coordinate diverse response systems, thereby helping us respond to important challenges and opportunities. So this is the, very detailed, very kind of nuanced definition of emotion from the Cultivating Emotional Balance literature. And this is quite different from the idea in Buddhism, and some of you have studied Buddhist philosophy, and sort of the closest thing to an emotion, there's an overlapping category called mental afflictions, right? Klesha is the Sanskrit word. And so in Buddhist psychology, we say that there are these, they're called mental factors. There's a group of mental factors, unwholesome mental factors. Some of them are emotions. Some of them are in the anger family and really overlap with this definition of emotion, but some of them are not emotions. And so sometimes that word klesha is even translated as disturbing emotions, but that's not really accurate because they're seen as thoughts. They're seen as cognitive, these mental elements. They don't have the whole idea of the physiology. They don't have the idea of that automatic appraisal in them. So for those of you studying Buddhism, be a little bit careful about equating that list of unwholesome mental factors that we find. There's 26 in the list. If any of you have studied mind and mental factors, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's okay, it doesn't matter. But for the people who have studied Buddhism, I'm going to stop sharing for a minute so I can see everybody. Like, be careful about equating a mental factor, an unwholesome mental factor with an emotion, because there is a lot of overlap. And then there are many mental factors that are not seen as emotions at all. The list of those mental factors, those unwholesome mental factors, are all seen as the result of some kind of distorted perception of reality, right? So in Buddhism, that's the emphasis there. And it's very interesting. The reason that those appear on the list of unwholesome mental factors is mostly because they really interfere with our meditation practice. So some of them are things like just distraction, thinking about pleasant, like having a fantasy about some sort of sensory pleasure, right? Not a destructive emotion, doesn't really hurt anyone if you're sitting around thinking about chocolate ice cream while you're supposed to be meditating, but it really messes up your meditation, right? So the whole emphasis there in the list of unwholesome mental factors is what's disturbing to your peace of mind, what's disturbing to your being able to meditate well. Whereas in, this idea of emotions, and especially destructive emotions, what's harmful to your own and others' welfare is more of the emphasis. So just being clear about that difference, which is really interesting. And we're going to talk about the function of emotions next, and then the list of these universal emotions. But I just wanted to stop there and see if there are any questions about the definition and about that distinction between kind of the Buddhist view and the kind of modern psychological view of what an emotion is. And I'm kind of compressing a 42-hour training into 2.5-hour sessions. So I realize it's a lot of material. But any questions about that so far? Anita. Hi, Anita.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Hi. So my question was more when we said evolutionary and physiological. So would that be both the parasympathetic, system as well as the sympathetic? I mean,
Yes.
is that what we're talking about? Both?
Yeah. And there's a wonderful system. There's a compassion researcher and Buddhist practitioner and psychotherapist called Paul Gilbert. And he has this beautiful model of the 3 emotional regulation systems. And he talks about the drive system, like driving us towards seeking out resources, the threat system, which is responding to threats. So that would be much more sympathetic nervous system, the amygdala and so forth. And then the soothing system, right, which is, activated by care, concern, compassion, comfort, right? So we can have both. It's interesting, we don't talk so much about love and compassion being emotions as much as we do a kind of a complex of mental states, but that is what's activates the parasympathetic nervous system, is the soothing system, care, concern, being in that kind of state. And that's what we would call more of the wholesome mental factors. In Buddhism, we have like kindness and compassion in the list of the wholesome mental factors. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of discussion about love and compassion. Are they emotions? Are they not emotions per se? Because we say emotions act really quickly, that automatic appraisal. If we feel that we are in an emotional state for hours, days, weeks, we're just re-triggering that emotion. We say emotions are very quick acting, like a matter of seconds. And if we feel that we're staying in that state, we're re-triggering the emotion. So that's one of the reasons why things like love and compassion, but I think there is something in there that relates to emotions, and that's more of the parasympathetic side. Yeah, great question. Awesome.
I have a follow-up. May I ask that?
Yeah, sure.
So in medicine, we would say that the sympathetic, that just comes up, parasympathetic, it's really not in our control. So here, when we're speaking about, dealing with emotions, here we're obviously saying we can't change some of that.
Yeah, yeah. In the moment, like when it's arising, you're absolutely right. Like if we get triggered for an emotion, that automatic appraisal, that's happening, that gets triggered. What we're going to look at is reappraisal of the trigger, especially for the learned one. There's nothing we could do when the chair collapses underneath us and we have that physiological response. And we don't really want to get rid of that. We're not trying to get rid of it. But there's a lot we can do about the ones that may involve some sort of distortion. And then we can, with our meditation practice, reevaluate and reappraise some of the triggers so that they aren't so triggering of emotion for us in the moment when they happen. But you're right, we don't have that kind of control because it is that automatic appraisal. So it takes the training before and after the emotional episode to attenuate that response. But yeah, we'll look at that. We'll look at what we call the emotional episode timeline and see where we can bring awareness into the steps. And it's often afterwards, it's often being aware of which triggers operate for us, reappraising the trigger, reevaluating what's going on. And then through our practice, realizing, maybe just to give an example and jumping ahead a little bit, maybe something happened very often when we were small, and we're still reacting as if we were 4 years old. And then we're an adult, we have more control. The thing is not a threat anymore. So through the cognitive process and through our contemplative practice, actually, we retrain in different ways of responding when that trigger is present. So it doesn't become a trigger for us anymore, right? And those are some of the personal ones, some of the learned ones. That's where we can, but you're right, absolutely right, not right in the moment because the physiology is already activated. We're already in that emotional state. Yeah, great question. Yeah,
Thank you.
good, great. And Teja.
Yeah, Venerable, I was just wondering if, this question of spiritual bypassing, that
Yeah,
many practitioners, they come to, whichever spiritual tradition, but very often we can fall into the trap of actually not addressing our interpersonal, relational, our behavior in those situations. And I'm
yeah.
just wondering, from your point of view, the fact that emotions are not spoken about in that way at all, let's say in Buddhist psychology, how do you think this interplays in somewhere, maybe students or practitioners with a genuine intention, but still kind of getting
Yeah,
lost?
that's right. That's right. And I think for me, that's one of the reasons I've become like quite passionate about teaching this training and cultivating emotional balance. Because for me too, I hadn't learned modern psychology much. I'd read and been interested, but I was really steeped in the Buddhist idea. And then this idea that emotions have a function, they save our lives. We're not trying to get rid of our emotions, right? We're just trying to enact them more constructively and not so destructively. Like to me, that was just this huge kind of epiphany of like, oh, wow. Because I think sometimes in spiritual life, there can be a wrong view that emotions are the enemy, or we should just be zen and peaceful and kind of not even happy in any kind of excited way, just sort of okay all the time, or bland or something, or that emotions are the enemy. So it was a big kind of breakthrough for me to go, no, we have this rich emotional life. We shouldn't try to suppress, because I think that's what sometimes happens is we don't know what to do. We bundle all the emotions together and just say, oh, I just need to somehow suppress, or anything that's triggering at all is disturbing of my peace of mind. So I'm going to avoid triggers, right? Which is not any kind of spiritual path either, to just avoidance. Oh, I'm going to go into a cave. There's all these stories about the people who went into the cave and then somebody interrupted them and they got totally angry and punched the guy in the face. It's like, okay, well, you're not really transforming your mind if you're just avoiding. things. And of course, in Tibetan Buddhism, there's all of these beautiful trainings of Lojong, like using the difficulties as a really essential part of the spiritual path. So I think there's sometimes I call it a Buddhist rumor or wrong view that what we're looking for is some sort of state of almost non-reactivity, right? But then you look at His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I mean, he is just out there experiencing everything. Like, all you need to do is look at some of these teachers. I would say, His Holiness, anything that's happening, he's like, wow, cool, what's that? Yeah, let's, he's not just sort of sitting there non-reactive. So I think it can be a wrong view that prevails, which is why I love really doing a deep dive into this idea of emotions, because I think sometimes we think to be spiritual means suppression, right? And even the Buddhist view is, instead of either suppressing our emotions on the one side or expressing them no matter what, and that can be, I remember maybe it was the 70s or 80s, there was this idea that if you suppress your emotions, like, you're going to get cancer. So just express everything. And people were beating pillows and shouting and all of this business, But in Buddhism, it's awareness and transformation, but not suppression. And I think we make that mistake sometimes, or bypass or avoidance, right? But it's about awareness and transformation. So that's really the way of dealing with it, which is kind of goes along with this idea of the Cultivating Emotional Balance curriculum too. But we're going to look at the function of emotions, and then the difference between constructive and destructive emotions, because in this training, we don't use the words positive and negative emotions. We say there is no such thing. It's not like we're supposed to either just be happy all the time. That's completely unrealistic, right? So even that idea we critique. Emotions have a function. They're all necessary for our well-being. Yeah. So sorry, long answer to your question, but that's something that I think about a lot, this whole idea of bypassing and suppressing. Yeah. Did that help?
Thank you so much. It helped a lot. Venerable, there's one more participant who has their hand up. It's a Subhashini ji. Would you take that question?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, please.
Subhashini ji, can you unmute yourself, please, and ask?
Yeah. You talked about klesha, and kleshas, in a sense, being used as an equivalent to emotions. Now, generally in the Buddhist context, the kleshas are considered to be negative, whether it, of course, anger, attachment, and both of them stemming from ignorance. So in that context, I would like you to tell us a little more about the whole idea of attachment, maybe because attachment is a disturbing emotion, in a sense that when you attach to somebody, there are certain expectations, there are certain, how do I put it? You think about that person, you want the person to be good to you. And maybe in that context, it's considered a disturbing emotion. I would like you to respond to that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And just to clarify, there isn't an exact equivalence between the idea of disturbing emotion and the idea of klesha. There's some overlap, but not an exact equivalence. So klesha has a different definition, mental factors that are disturbing to our peace of mind. Now, some of those are also emotions, like there's a whole anger family. For example, in the list of kleshas, there's belligerence, for example, and several others that have to do resentment, several others that have to do with anger. But there's several that, like you say, exactly right, are due to some distorted perception that wouldn't be on the list of emotions. They don't have necessarily the physiology that goes along with them and so forth. Attachment is a really interesting, tricky one, that also most people don't really want to get rid of their attachment. They're really happy to get rid of their anger, but I've also never had anyone come to me and say, help me get rid of my attachment. But the definition of attachment, we say attachment involves experiencing an object as pleasant. So the object could be a person, an event, a material object, even a concept. So experiencing an object as pleasant, exaggerating the pleasant qualities of the object. So that's where the distorted perception comes in. And then thinking that by possessing and retaining that object, I'm going to have lasting happiness. So all of that distortion built into the idea of attachment. So just wanting things, just liking things, and this is another one of the Buddhist rumors, it's fine to like things. I really like chocolate. That's fine. But if I like chocolate to the point where I exaggerate, I need to have chocolate every day or I'm not going to be happy, and I need to hoard chocolate and have my entire cupboard filled with chocolate, you know, that's where it becomes disturbing to my peace of mind. But just having, and His Holiness says there's different words for desire and attachment, and just wanting things and liking things and preferring things is fine. But when it goes into that distorted relationship that we're projecting our happiness being dependent on external objects, that's when it becomes a problem. Because as we all know, we can't control whether we have those things or not. You know, if we feel our happiness depends on them, we're liable to get disappointed, but it doesn't mean just liking things. So does that help? Does that help clarify?
Yes, to some extent.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we might get into that a little bit more later on. We're going to talk mostly about anger, but anger actually involves a similar kind of distortion or aversion. When we talk in Buddhism, we talk more about aversion, and we say it's the same definition except 180 degrees opposite. Experiencing something as unpleasant, exaggerating the unpleasant qualities of the object, and thinking that by being separated from it, I'm going to have lasting happiness. So in both of those ways, we say that attachment and aversion involve, as you said, involve that distortion, that distorted projection. And then I think there was a question in the chat. Let me just check. Is the revelation about suppressing emotions causing cancer scientific? I don't think it is. I think that's a rumor. I don't think there, I mean, I remember people, and people still talk like that. Somebody said that to me last week, you know, suppressing your emotions causes cancer. I don't know. I'll try and look it up before tomorrow's class and see if I can find any data on that. But I think that's just, and Anita, you may know, do you know anything about research about suppression?
There's nothing absolutely valid. So like you said, it's completely rumors.
Yeah.
And it's anecdotal. They say that people who suppress emotions have more breast cancer in women, for example, or thyroid cancer. Right. But it's also related, I think, to the chakras, as they say. You know, if you speak chakra, if you don't use or suppress. So, but I think these are still anecdotal. I don't think there's any hard evidence.
Yeah, but you know, you hear that a lot, and for me it becomes problematic because it seems very shaming to people who have cancer. You know, it's a way of pathologizing and saying, oh, you got cancer just because of your emotional life. And, you know, so I don't think it's helpful. So I think we need to maybe not pass that rumor along because it can be quite shaming. Yeah. All right. Oh my goodness. We have so much to talk about, you guys. Like I said, I'm squeezing 42 hours into an hour and a half. But let's look at the function of emotion. And then I already talked about constructive and destructive emotions. And then we're actually also going to meditate in our time together. So we'll try and get to that. But I want to share another slide. So when we talk about the function of emotions, we say emotions save our lives with quick quick appraisal and response. So, for example, using fear to instantly swerve away from an animal on the road. So again, we don't want to get rid of emotions. Emotions have this function that's extremely important. So the idea of, Buddhist practice, getting rid of your emotions, absolutely not. We need our emotions. They function, they motivate us into action. And they help us in communicating and understanding the wants and needs of others through distinct signals in the voice and facial expressions. This is super interesting. One of the founders of the Cultivating Emotional Balance training is a psychologist called Paul Ekman. And he did a study showing that the facial expressions of emotion are universal for all humans, irrespective of culture. He did his research in the 60s. He went to Papua New Guinea to an uncontacted tribe that had never had any exposure to any outsiders, no media, no television, nothing else, and found that for these 7 universal emotions, the facial expressions are the same as people from any other country, any other culture. Before then, anthropologists thought that emotional expression was learned. Now, there's definitely a lot of cultural difference in which emotions are acceptable to express, right? And in different cultures, people will try to suppress the expression of specific emotions, even within families. Sometimes when I do the training in person, we talk a lot about cultural differences and even within the family. Often the father was allowed to express anger, but nobody else in the family was. That's very common across cultures. I taught a class once, very multicultural. I had 2 men from South India, 2 men from Kerala. This is in California. A man from Nicaragua, a man from Mexico, an African-American woman, 2 Asian immigrants. I think one was Vietnamese, one was Chinese, many, many different cultures represented. And we ended up spending the whole session talking about cultural differences in the expression of emotion, but there is universality in terms of how emotions are expressed, because we say that those facial expressions and the signals in the voice predated the development of language, right? And to save lives, think about our evolutionary past. We lived in small tribes, small groups. It was important. If you had a fear expression on your face, it communicated to everyone else in your tribe that there was a threat going on right now. Laughter helps us connect with others. Sadness evokes support and comfort in the face of a shared loss, right? So all of these things in our evolutionary past. Now it may be these days, the way we live, we might not want to express our sadness, for example, in our workplace. It might make us feel more vulnerable. But when we lived, in our evolutionary past, it was something very functional. So expressing these through our faces and our vocal tones. So we talked about constructive and destructive emotions. We say constructive emotions are emotions that are conducive to our own and others' happiness and further our cooperation and collaboration. The right emotion at the right time, the right amount, expressed in a way that does no harm. And then destructive emotions are regrettable emotions that are incompatible with our own and others' happiness, an inappropriate intensity or duration, inappropriate emotion expressed in a hurtful way, or suppression is destructive. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. And this was a big insight for me when I took this training, is getting away from the language positive and negative emotions and using the language constructive and destructive, because these emotions, researchers say, any emotion at all can be constructive, any emotion at all can be destructive. So can you think of an example of a constructive emotion that may not feel good subjectively, right? Because sometimes when we think of positive and negative emotion, negative just means anything that doesn't feel good, right? And positive means, oh, it feels good. So what would be an example of a constructive emotion that might not feel so great, but might be constructive to our own and others' welfare? Can anybody think of an example? And if you can just unmute. Nervousness, like a nervous excitement. Can you say more about that? What would be constructive about that? Arundhati, you want to unmute for a
Hi,
minute?
yeah.
Yeah.
It's like when you're preparing for a talk or, to present yourself somewhere, there's an excitement and there's also nervousness, which for me has helped in preparing better.
Okay, because it's kind of energizing, like it gives
Yeah.
you the energy.
It makes me think it makes me think with more structure, because otherwise I'm free flowing. But the nervousness helps me kind of structure things and prepare for things with a kind of focus that the excitement doesn't. So it's a nervous excitement.
Yeah,
Yeah.
awesome. Great
Thank you.
example. That's an example I haven't heard before. I love that example. So it doesn't feel so great because it has that feeling of nervousness, but yeah, it's energizing and focusing, right? And helps you prepare. One time, a number of years ago, I went with my teacher of cultivating emotional balance, Eve Ekman, who did the teacher training. And we went and taught in a men's prison where I teach and have a group. And we did a day-long workshop on cultivating emotional balance, an amazing experience with about 120 of these men in this maximum security prison in California. And when we asked this question that I just asked, one of the men said, oh, sadness is constructive because it shows me that what I lost really mattered to me. And I was like, wow, that's an awesome example, right? Like if you feel sadness, it doesn't feel great, but the kind of the message of sadness is, wow, I really cared about that thing that I lost, right? So that would be another example. Yeah, Nivita, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm not sure if this is like I haven't quite put this into words yet in my head, but the first thing that came into my mind was patience, as something that is like that can be really difficult or like even forced to be patient in the moment with somebody. It can feel really forced, but of course it's very constructive.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it doesn't feel that great. I'm not sure patience would exactly be an emotion.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's an emotion either.
Yeah, but it's
Yeah.
definitely a quality or a state, because sometimes
Mhm.
in longer class, we talk about the difference between emotions, moods, states, and traits, like personality traits. These are 4 kind of levels, right? So patience it might be a personality trait. It
I
might be
see.
a state that you put yourself in that moment.
I see.
Yeah. In those kind of 4 different gradations, which can be very related, but but that's a great example of something that is challenging, but definitely beneficial, right? In the moment to feel patience. Yeah, Tisha.
Venerable, I just wanted to quickly say that, in nonviolent communication, for example, they use the words that, emotions that serve life or that don't serve life.
I like that.
Because even destructive and constructive, I mean, of course, the same, because I'm trying to understand why you prefer not using, let's say, negative, not you, or let's say the framework of
Right,
this
right.
program, the cultivating emotional balance, not using positive or negative versus destructive and constructive, is because you're saying you can have a kind of negative feeling and yet it can be constructive, right?
That's right. That's
And
right. It's kind of getting away from the idea that anything that doesn't feel good is negative, and you are just supposed to be happy all the time, which is unrealistic. Yeah.
Yeah, so it just helps that, things that serve life or not serve life, because the same destructive emotion in another context could have a constructive
That's
performance
right.
function. Yeah. Okay. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's right. Like the sadness, like for example, for sadness, right? Very I mean, how inappropriate would it be to go to a funeral or memorial service and be like, hey, everybody, how's it going? Yeah, laugh. I mean, totally inappropriate. Whereas expressing sadness, we say the function of sadness is to invoke like connection and comfort in the face of a shared loss. So in that way, it's constructive for everyone. Like you just see, even you're crying, you're, holding hands with people, you're sharing these stories. So constructive, even though it doesn't feel good in the moment. And then in the chat, somebody put anger. That we're going to talk about that all tomorrow. That's the topic of tomorrow, just because, what is constructive anger, right? And I remember when I took this training, and for many of you, it may be the same thing. I was sort of thinking from my Buddhist training, oh, any anger is destructive. And, you hear this Master Shantideva, a moment of anger, destroys eons of virtue. And you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? But it's important to unpack the meaning of, the English word anger can mean several different things, only one of which is what Master Shantideva said and anger can so often be destructive to our own and others' well-being. But I love this framing of, what supports life, or just, I love that phrase. Actually, I'd never heard that before in NBC. I really like that way of framing it too. But yeah, the whole idea of like, it's not about whether it feels good or not. It's about, is it constructive to our own and others' welfare or not? Yeah, yeah. Anybody else? Oh, so the second question is, what about a destructive emotion that feels good? That's a trickier one. So a destructive positive in the sense of feels good emotion. Can anybody think of, that's a trickier one?
Something like Schadenfreude, the German word.
Yeah. So tell us what that's about, Anita. Yeah.
So Schadenfreude is when someone is built up, or you look up to someone, and when they have a fall, you secretly look forward to that person falling. So it feels good, but it's very destructive emotion.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's that thing. I always use the example of like, in the workplace, you have a coworker that you really don't like at all. And then one day you're here, they're, getting a divorce or something. And you're like, oh, that's terrible. Tell me more. It's that thing of delighting in the misfortune of others. So definitely not constructive to our own and others' well-being. And there's a way that it feels good. So that's a very traditional example of a destructive one that feels really good. When you overeat and it gives you pleasure, yeah, that one too. So there's probably other, indulging in a sense pleasure, right? Any sense pleasure, indulging in something that feels really good, a sense pleasure, but as bad for you, like eating way too much chocolate or cake or, any number of things. So that's another one. Okay. Let's look. Oh my goodness, we've only got half an hour. Let's look. What I'd love to do is just look at that list. I've hinted at it before, of these universals. Now, there are more emotions that are universal than the ones on the list that I'm going to present to you. But these are the ones that have a universal facial expression, according to Paul Ekman's research. So there's something very important about this list of 7 that was important in our communication with others, in our tribe, in our community, right? To be able to express on our face. And this relates to empathy, which isn't an emotion, but it's a quality that gives rise to compassion, really being able to understand the experience of others. And apparently humans are better at empathy than any other species. They say that our primate relatives also have a lot of empathy. But for us, we have these very nuanced facial expressions that communicate our emotions to others in our group and allow us to have a kind of an empathic resonance, kind of an emotional connection to other people around us. We don't have to know the story. We don't have to understand. That's another aspect of empathy, is perspective taking, putting ourselves in the other person's shoes. But when we see the face of someone, and I think we've all done this, you see someone with a really sad face, maybe they're crying, maybe it's this stranger in a coffee shop or walking down the street, you immediately go, oh, and you make the same face, right? So we have that resonance with the emotional experience of others through these facial expressions, also body language, also tones of voice. There's a lot of research now. There's a researcher called Dr. Keltner at the Greater Good Science Center, and he's doing all of these, this research on the vocal, what he calls vocal bursts, just these vocal tones, not the words, but just the tone of voice that communicates emotion. So there's a lot more research coming up, but I want to show this list of the 7 universals. Whoops, we're going to skip over. We kind of talked about this already. Whoops. All about what's appropriate and inappropriate. So anger, we're going to talk about this tomorrow. The function of anger, or the theme of anger, is removing an obstacle. So the evolutionary theme of anger is removing an obstacle that's in the way of something we want, period, right? You think of, I think of the example of road rage, which we have a lot of in California. I think you probably have a lot in India too, right? So somebody is obstructing us. It's this innate thing that there's an obstacle. Somebody just cuts in front of you, and then this thing comes up. It's that automatic appraisal of an obstacle. You're just driving along. Sometimes it's accompanied with fear too, because it feels dangerous, but it's that obstacle in the way of me getting what I want. So that's the theme of fear. Fear, flight, escaping from a threat. Okay. Sadness, and we talked about this, being reassured and eliciting connection and caring, creating connection in the face of loss. So we can see how that can be constructive, even if it doesn't feel good. Also fear, very constructive. It motivates you into action to escape from the threat. It's very interesting. Fear does not appear on the list of kleshas. The 26 kleshas don't include any kind of fear type emotions, because it's seen as something that's not at all destructive. It's important. Disgust. This is a universal. There's a facial expression that involves wrinkling your nose, kind of lifting your upper lip, sometimes even your tongue coming out to expel something poisonous. There can be physical disgust, and actually disgust, this is interesting, it was one of the later emotions to evolve in human beings after we started hunting and eating meat, right? Because before then, we didn't really have to have physical disgust, but when large animals were hunted, then there was the very real possibility that the meat would go bad. And we needed to be able to express to others, oh, don't eat that, it's poisonous. We also have social disgust about others' behavior. And interestingly, we show exactly the same facial expression somebody does something that you find really disgusting, right? Some kind of, so outside the realm of social norms, you did the same, ugh. The same thing you do with physical disgust, a bad smell, you do with your face with social disgust. So that's interesting. And then contempt, which is different from disgust. And the function of contempt is to assert superiority. And you might think, gosh, contempt is just horrible. Why is that something that we evolved? What's the function of that? This is an interesting one. Again, you can think of our evolutionary past or even our primate cousins. It takes a lot of energy to fight to establish hierarchy. Most primates have a hierarchy of like the leader, the alpha, the leader of the troop of chimpanzees or gorillas or whoever it is, and everybody else. And sometimes there's a whole rigid hierarchy. If the alpha had to fight every single other chimp in the troop, there wouldn't be enough food to go around. That is, very expensive energetically to fight. So a show of contempt, which is a unilateral facial expression, like one side of the lip goes up like a sneer, right? The alpha chimp is challenged by a junior that there's no way the junior one is going to be able to beat him in a fight. To save energy, the alpha chimp just shows a contempt face, and then the other one just backs down. So it's interesting. I think of, especially in the United States, I'm not sure about India. I think the kids are maybe more respectful, although this might be changing. All you need to do to think of a really good contempt face is to think of an American teenager, right? Trying desperately to assert some kind of superiority, right? They're individuating, they're trying to assert themselves and rise in the hierarchy. So they always have that contempt face. And then surprise. And so this is an emotion that focuses attention to identify something. It's the most quick acting one because surprise can lead to any of the others. We open our eyes, sometimes we open our mouth, just that facial expression, we're taking in all of the information so that we know how to respond, either anger, sadness, disgust, whatever it is, we're taking in information with that surprise. And then there's a whole list of enjoyable emotions. The universal facial expression for that is usually a smile. And it's one of the ones that can be seen the farthest away, because in our evolutionary past, again, when someone was walking towards you through the African savannah, you needed to know if they were a threat or if they were somebody friendly. And so they'd show a smile and you could see that from far away and you knew you didn't need to prepare to fight. And those emotions, this whole family of enjoyable emotions, deepens connection and cooperation. So there are many other emotions that are universal that don't have a universal expression. For example, jealousy and envy. We don't always want to express that, right? When we're feeling jealous or envious, we didn't evolve a facial expression for that because that was something that often we were interested in masking or hiding. But this is the list of the 7 that really help support our communication with others about things that are important to our welfare. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and see if there's any questions about those 7. And so all of these 7 can be either destructive or constructive. And this was the thing when I studied this modality of cultivating emotional balance, right? I was like, oh, wow, that's a different framing. They can all be useful for our own and others' welfare, or all be destructive, as we saw. Even the enjoyable emotion of delighting in someone else's misfortune, right, can be something that's destructive. So one of the things, and I want to introduce a practice and actually lead you through a short guided practice for the ending of our time together. And then tomorrow we're going to focus primarily on anger. I want to start tomorrow actually with some, techniques for how to attenuate our emotions. I mentioned before how, when Anita said, if these emotions are very automatic, how do we bring awareness to them? We'll look at this in terms of our practice that we're doing today. And then before we go into anger tomorrow, what I want to do is review some of the ways that we can work on attenuating our emotions. One of the things, like I said, in Buddhism, we say that the approach to emotions is awareness and transformation. So the bypass that we were talking about, the suppression that we were talking about, with awareness, often the emotion just untangles itself, right? We bring awareness to the emotion. For example, and we'll talk about anger more tomorrow, anger is often a secondary emotion. And what's more primary is something like sadness or fear. And we use anger as a way to remove the obstacle of feeling some kind of vulnerability like sadness or fear. And this is really important with anger. So if we allow ourselves to just feel what it is that we're feeling, then we don't have to go to anger as a way of bypassing the sadness or fear. So there's a technique I want to introduce to you. There's a meditation practice called RAIN. Some of you may have heard of it. There's a meditation teacher called Michelle McDonald Smith, and she kind of came up with this practice. It's in the mindfulness tradition. There's a meditation teacher called Tara Brach, who really focuses on, and I see some people nodding, so you might be familiar with this practice. It's a wonderful way of just kind of allowing and bringing mindfulness to our emotional experience. The acronym RAIN, it's an acronym that stands for recognize, allow, investigate, and non-identification. So I'll guide you through, we'll finish with this practice for today. The recognition of the emotional experience is the first step, just recognizing what it is that we're feeling, and then allowing that emotional experience to be what it is. Sometimes that's all we need to regulate the emotion. The investigation then is an important step. Why is this triggering for me? What's my story around this emotional experience? Maybe there's some kind of narrative that I've built up around this emotional experience. And then the non-identification. In the end, I am not that emotion. Sometimes in English, we say, I am angry. I am afraid. There's this identification in the verb that we use. In some other languages, the verb is more something like, I have anger. I have fear. I've heard in Portuguese, the construction is something like, I am with fear, or I am with anger. So different languages give different sort of identifications with the emotion that we're experiencing. But the non-identification is the emotion is arising, it's passing. It's not who I am. Sometimes we get so caught up in the emotion, we feel that it's part of our identity. So I want to guide you through, this is kind of a one-size-fits-all technique for our emotional experience in general. And then tomorrow we'll look more at specifically how to work with anger. But for the rest of our time, I want to guide you through this practice just for about 15 minutes, because that's about all the time that we've got left. So going ahead and getting in a comfortable meditation posture for about 15 minutes of practice, wherever you're sitting, just trying to get in a comfortable position. It's hard sometimes when we're on Zoom, we may not be sitting in the chair or the cushion that we usually would for a meditation session, but trying to get yourself as comfortable as possible. Bringing your attention to your body as you settle into your posture, making sure your back is straight in whatever place that you're sitting. Your back is straight, your shoulders even. Your tongue can be on the roof of your mouth right behind your teeth, which keeps you from having to swallow. You can have your eyes either closed or in a hooded gaze slightly open, your hands resting in your lap or resting on your knees. And then just taking a moment to sweep your attention through your body, just do a body scan, noticing if there's any tightness or tension or constriction in the body, and deliberately relaxing. Bring your attention to your neck and shoulders, where we often hold a lot of tightness. Your jaw, relaxing your jaw. Relaxing your belly. And then we'll round off this initial settling of the body with 3 deep breaths. So really deep inhalation all the way down to the diaphragm. Deep exhalation. And this activates that soothing system, that parasympathetic nervous system we were talking about before. So 3 deep breaths. And then after the 3 deep breaths, just take a moment to focus on the sensations of the breath in the body, the ordinary respiration without any alteration, without manipulating the breath in any way, just the ordinary sensations in the body, wherever it is that you can feel them. It might be in the diaphragm, in the belly. It might be in your chest expanding and contracting. It might be in the nostrils. I'm just taking a few moments to be with the breath. And then think of an emotional trigger that you'd like to bring more attention to. So something that has left you with a regrettable feeling, maybe an emotional episode that you experience regularly that feels like it distances you from others after the emotion has passed. And try not to pick something too traumatic, like the hardest emotional episode that you experience, or something really triggering, maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, picking something that's maybe like a 4 or a 5. So something that's activating but not overwhelming emotionally. And then when you think of the emotion you'd like to bring more attention to, bringing to mind a specific instance where this emotional trigger makes you feel contracted and stuck in that experience, or you feel makes you enact behavior that's deconstructive. So thinking of a specific instance, bringing it to mind through your imagination, beginning to picture or feel yourself in that situation. Visualizing, drawing from your memory, if the situation involved another person, envisioning the person's face or voice or behavior that was triggering. If you're by yourself, bring to mind the thoughts or behaviors that triggered you. And hold this episode in mind. You might feel the emotion arising as you trigger yourself from memory. Again, try not to get completely overwhelmed. If you start to feel too flooded, just release the memory for a moment and go back to the breath. but really calling to mind from that specific instance of that emotion. And starting to become aware of the emotional experience and recognize whatever is happening. If it's helpful, you can name the emotion that's present. So often when something feels unpleasant, we want to avoid, to suppress, to deny, but recognizing what's present and then allowing the emotional experience to be here instead of distraction or suppression, just sitting and allowing that emotional experience that was re-triggered from that memory. And then with a caring presence, begin to investigate. Is there any underlying belief connected to the emotion? Maybe an idea of not being able to trust others. Maybe some kind of belief of I'm not good enough. I'm going to fail. Maybe a connection with that experience, with maybe something we experienced a lot in childhood, just investigating the trigger of that emotion. Is there some story that goes along with that, some narrative, some association? And just letting whatever it is arise, if there's any insight around that trigger with the investigation. And if you notice some sort of underlying belief or story or narrative, investigate what kind of sensations arise in the body as you notice what might be present. And observing these sensations and thoughts with a caring presence. If it's helpful, you can bring your right hand to your chest to symbolize that there's a heartfelt concern of kindness and compassion accompanying you during this experience. Sometimes we talk about investigate with kindness. So instead of judgment, instead of harshness, we're investigating with kindness. And then continue noticing these thoughts and sensations from the quiet space of awareness without being stuck inside them, noticing that the experiences, the thoughts, the sensations arise and pass. So the non-identification, we're just having this as an experience. We're just experiencing these thoughts, these sensations. They're not who we are. Even when emotions feel overwhelming, but they're not who we are. They're just experiences we're having. So really noticing from that quiet space of awareness as these thoughts and sensations arise and pass. And then releasing the thoughts, releasing the investigation, and just returning to the breath for a moment, just feeling whatever feelings might be alive in your body, using that anchor of the breath. Okay. So that was just a very brief introduction to that rain practice, but it can be so useful. You know, as Anita said earlier, like we respond very automatically, but if after the experience of the emotion, we can take the experience to the meditation cushion using this practice, it's a way of gaining insight into, you know, why is that experience triggering for me? Where did the emotion come from? And it may really attenuate the emotional experience the next time around as we bring that kind of insight to the experience. And this can be a really great way to kind of regulate our emotional response and bring more awareness. Because the point with emotions, as I said, is not to get rid of our emotions, but to bring choice to our emotional experience, especially choice as to how we enact our emotions. Our emotions have information for us. So if we can get the message and then enact that emotion in a constructive way, that's really what we're trying to do with these practices. So I found, you know, for a lot of students, this very simple RAIN practice, like I said, it sort of works for all of our emotional responses. And then there's specific techniques for the different emotions. Tomorrow we'll look at another technique specifically for the emotion of anger, another way to analyze the emotion of anger. But the RAIN kind of works for all of our emotions. Are there any questions, or would anybody like to share anything from your experience with that practice? Again, very, very brief. What I might do is share some resources that can be sent out to you later on. So if you'd like to have more experience with that emotion, there's some really good guided meditations on the RAIN practice, you know, YouTube videos and things like that. Any questions or comments on that practice?
Why is it called the RAIN one?
Yeah, so RAIN is the acronym for the 4 steps: recognize, allow, investigate, and non-identification. So it's just an acronym for the 4 different steps.
Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, and in fact, I've got a slide. Let me share the screen because I made a slide that let's see, I'll have to skip forward a couple of slides. We'll do this tomorrow. Sorry, here we go. Becoming aware of the affect program through RAIN, recognize what is happening, allow life to be just as it is, investigate inner experience with the caring presence, and then non-identification. So that's why we call it RAIN. And it's just kind of,
what
can
does
you
it
see?
mean to say investigate the inner experience with a caring presence?
Yeah. So with kindness, sometimes when we investigate, we can be harsh and judgmental about our experience. Like, for example, for that one, we're looking at, oh, is there some sort of story? do I have a story of I'm not good enough? And so I'm always, people are always going to be angry at me because I can never do anything right, like examples like that. So it's important with the investigation that we don't have a harsh attitude towards ourselves or just reinforce some sort of story about I'm worthless, I'm not good enough, this always happens to me because I deserve it, things like that, right? So with the investigation, we're bringing that caring presence and that kindness to ourselves as well. So we're not just reinforcing that harsh inner critic that we can often have about our own experience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. And
Yeah.
and non-identification?
So that means sometimes especially when we're feeling a strong emotional experience, we're flooded with emotion. It can almost feel like I am that emotion. I am anger. It feels so overwhelming. So the non-identification says, this is just something that's arising, these sensations of emotion, the thoughts that accompany this emotion, they're arising, they abide for some time, and then they pass away. They're not who I am. They're not my fundamental nature. They're just things that arise in response to some experience that I'm having. So it's sort of holding that spacious awareness and noticing the sensations and the thoughts arising within that sort of field of awareness is what we do with that step. Yeah. All right. Any other questions about that experience? Okay. So tomorrow we'll look at one of the slides that I skipped quickly, just in the interest of time, and just looking more at how we manage and how we bring mindfulness to our emotional experience and to the triggers in general. And then we'll spend the rest of the session looking at the emotion of anger, which is something, to be honest, I mean, I've been brainwashed a little bit by Buddhism. So when I did the teacher training for cultivating emotional balance, I had a lot of arguments with my teachers about the emotion of anger because I was thinking, oh, emotion is always, anger is always negative, it's always destructive. And then I sort of changed my view quite a lot, but it's a tricky one. So that's why I wanted to spend an entire session really unpacking the emotion of anger. So that's what's on the agenda for tomorrow morning. And tomorrow evening for you, 6 o'clock in the morning again for me tomorrow. So thank you all so much for your attention today and for coming to our session. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. And do you have any announcements, Tejal, or anything to add?
Just really want to thank you, Venerable, for this. It's I can completely understand, how much you are trying to compact in this short period of time. So I'm very grateful that, it's a good teaser and we can share with our participants, resources for further deepening this journey. And so thank you to all the participants and to you. And we'll send the recording hopefully within 12 hours to the participants. And yeah.
Okay, great. And I always invite in my Zoom classes, I always invite if everyone wants to unmute and say goodbye to your friends as you're logging off. That's kind of a nice way to close out, and have a wonderful day tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow evening for anger. Oh boy.
Thank you. Thank you very
so
much,
much.
Venerable.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you. Thank
Thank
you. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you tomorrow.